All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest, most fundamental questions you can possibly ask. It sounds so simple, but it's a question that has tied philosophers, biologists, and physicists in knots for centuries. What exactly is life? What is that essential spark that separates, say, a person from a rock? It's a question that you'll see just gets weirder and more complicated the deeper you look.
In fact, the problem is so tough that some people have put forward this really provocative idea. What if the reason we can't define life is because, in a fundamental way, it doesn't really exist as its own special category? Just keep that idea in the back of your mind, because it's going to become surprisingly important as we dig in.
You know, this reminds me of when I was a kid in school, and I learned what I thought was the secret to the whole universe. Something's alive, if it's born, it grows, it reproduces, and it dies. I thought I'd cracked the code. I remember sitting outside testing this idea on everything. I'd look at a big boulder and think, okay, well, if a small rock breaks off, it's kind of born, and if that rock splits in two, maybe that's reproducing, but then I'd get stuck. A rock doesn't really grow, and it doesn't die. So my perfect, simple definition completely failed its very first test against a plain old rock.
So that childhood test is basically a simple version of the first place most of us start. Here's our game plan for this investigation. We're going to start with those checklists, then see what a quantum physicist had to say about it, how NASA has to deal with the problem, and then we'll look at some really modern ideas about life as information and as a complex system. And then we'll come back to that really unsettling question we started with.
Okay, so let's start with our first suspect in the search for a definition. It's the most common one out there, the checklist. The basic idea is, hey, if we can just list enough properties that all living things share, boom, we'll have our answer.
And yeah, that simple list we learned in school, it gets a bit more scientific, as you can see here. But the fundamental problem is exactly the same. This is a list of things life does, not a definition of what life is. It's like trying to define water by saying it's a clear liquid that you can swim in, instead of just explaining its chemical structure, H2O. So the key takeaway here is simple, but it's absolutely crucial. A checklist describes life's behavior, not its essence.
And this checklist approach, it just falls apart almost immediately. I mean, check this out. Fire. It grows, it consumes energy, and you could say it reproduces by spreading. It actually checks off more boxes on our list than a tardigrade, one of the toughest creatures on Earth when it's in a state of suspended animation. In that state, the tardigrade has no metabolism, it doesn't grow, it doesn't reproduce. Yet we all agree fire isn't alive, and the tardigrade absolutely is.
And the reproduction rule? Oh man, that one's even worse. A single bacterium can just split in two on its own. So sure, it's alive. But what about a mule? Mules are sterile. They can't reproduce. So by a strict checklist definition, no mule is alive. The same goes for a single cat that can't find a mate, or any person who happens to be sterile. Clearly, being able to reproduce can't be a hard and fast rule for an individual to be considered alive. The whole checklist idea, it's just a dead end.
So the checklist is a total bust. It's just riddled with exceptions. So let's just throw that out and look at this from a completely different angle, one that popped up in the 1940s from a super unexpected source, one of the founders of quantum mechanics.
The physicist Erwin Schrödinger published this hugely influential book, What is Life, back in 1944. And what's just mind-blowing about this is the timing. This was a full decade before we even knew what DNA looked like, before Watson and Crick discovered the double helix. Back then, nobody was really sure what genes were or how they worked.
Okay, so Schrödinger had these two absolutely game-changing ideas. First, he looked at life like a physicist would. He knew about the second law of thermodynamics, this fundamental rule that everything in the universe tends to go from order to chaos. Your hot coffee gets cold, a sandcastle crumbles. But life is the ultimate rebel. It creates and maintains incredible order. And Schrödinger's insight was that it does this by feeding on order from its environment, what he called negative entropy, to fight off that universal tendency towards decay.
But his second idea, this is where it gets almost prophetic. He was wondering how a tiny little gene could possibly store all the information needed to build an entire organism. He guessed it must be what he called an aperiodic crystal, basically a really stable molecule with a complex, non-repeating pattern that could act like a code script. He was, without knowing it, perfectly describing the DNA molecule years before anyone had ever seen it. Just incredible.
Schrödinger's ideas were just, wow, they inspired a whole generation of biologists. But they were still a bit, philosophical. They weren't a practical test you could run. Then, decades later, a new group came along with a very, very practical problem to solve: NASA. I mean, if you're going to spend billions of dollars looking for life on other planets, you better have a pretty good idea of what you're looking for.
So in 1994, NASA put a team on it, and they came back with what a lot of people think is the most elegant, most powerful definition yet. Life is a self-sustaining system capable of Darwinian evolution. That's it. Just two rules. It has to keep itself going, and it has to be able to evolve.
And you know what? This is pretty good. It cleans up a lot of our old problems. Crystals might grow, but they don't evolve, so they're out. Viruses evolve for sure, but they can't sustain themselves without a host cell. So under this definition, they're not alive. But this also creates this new gray area. What about a parasitic worm? It can't live outside its host either. Is it not alive? Suddenly the line between a virus and a parasite looks a little fuzzy.
But that self-sustaining part isn't even the weirdest problem. It's the second part, the capable of Darwinian evolution bit, that really opens up a bizarre and totally unexpected can of worms. See, over in the world of computer science, there's this thing called a genetic algorithm. These are programs that basically create whole populations of digital solutions to a problem. The best ones are selected, and then they reproduce with little mutations to create the next, better generation. So, wait a minute. They are, quite literally, self-sustaining systems capable of Darwinian evolution. Under NASA's own definition, some chunks of computer code could actually be considered alive. How weird is that?
And that strange kind of mind-bending conclusion actually leads us right into one of the most powerful ideas in modern biology. This idea of seeing life not as a certain type of stuff, but as a process of managing information.
Nobel Prize winner Paul Nurse calls it wetware. We think of our computers as having fixed hardware and then flexible software running on it. A cell is totally different. Its hardware, all the molecules and chemical pathways, is floating around in this fluid, chemical soup. That means the connections themselves are always changing and being rewired. It's an incredibly dynamic and adaptable information processing machine.
So, from this viewpoint, what makes a cell alive is that it's just a master of information. It reads the digital code in its DNA, of course, but it's also constantly processing this flood of data from its own internal state and from the world outside. It's this constant flow of information that lets all those unbelievably complex parts work together as one coherent, purposeful thing.
Okay, so this leads us to our next big clue. If life is a process based on information, what kind of process is it? Well, the answer might be in seeing a living thing not just as a bag of parts, but as a special kind of complex system.
And there are two really cool concepts here. First, there's autopoiesis. It's a fancy word, but it just means a system whose main job is to constantly build and rebuild itself. Basically, life makes itself. And second, life is an emergent property. This is huge. It means life isn't a property you can find in any single molecule, not in a carbon atom, not in a protein. It emerges from the incredibly complex interactions of all those non-living parts working together.
All right, so we've been on quite a journey. We've looked at checklists, quantum physics, NASA, even computer science. We've seen life as a process, as information, as a complex system. But now we have to circle all the way back to that big philosophical question we started with.
Remember this quote from the very beginning? After everything we've looked at, this idea that maybe we can't define life because there's nothing special to define, it suddenly doesn't sound so crazy, does it? If life is just something that emerges from complex chemical information processing, then maybe there is no magic line separating the living from the non-living.
And that leaves us right here with this one last thought. We look at a daisy and a drop of water, and we just know they're different, right? Like fundamentally different, a different kind of thing. But what if that's just an illusion? What if the only real difference isn't one of kind, but one of degree? Perhaps life is simply the name we give to matter when it reaches a level of organized complexity so mind-bogglingly vast that it begins to sustain, reproduce, and evolve itself. The mystery, it seems, just continues.
If you found this video helpful, give it a like, leave a comment, and share your thoughts or questions. And subscribe to Science LM for more clear and well-explained science. See you in the next video.